Hi everyone, I'm Pam from Murdoch University in Perth, Australia, and this paper is joint work with Erica Mason. What we're presenting today is not a completed study. It's really the beginning of a research direction. What we want to do is outline what we see as a growing problem in education and propose a possible way forward, particularly around the role that design thinking might play in supporting future skills learning. As part of our academic teaching role at Murdoch Uni, we regularly engage with local high schools, both private and public, delivering professional development workshops to teachers. These are often focused on the use of design thinking in the classroom. Design thinking is often described as a structured, human-centered approach to problem solving. It emphasizes empathy, iteration, creativity, and testing ideas out in real-world contexts. These workshops specifically support teachers with the idea of adopting these innovative design thinking practices that have been emerging around the world into their curriculums. In recent years, we've been approached by more and more teachers who are feeling increasingly overwhelmed and time poor, particularly in the context of needing to adapt their teaching practices in response to these rapid changes in the education system, especially with the rise of AI in learning environments. What we're hearing quite consistently is that while there's a really clear recognition that teaching needs to change, there's much less clarity about how to do that in practice. High school teachers are particularly challenged by their curriculum formats, which involve short hour-long class sessions as opposed to academic or industry-based practice environments where there's a greater allocation of time for workshopping ideas and moving through processes. Brief workshop sessions leave little time for experimentation, iteration, testing, and reflection when trying to adopt new teaching practices. The image here shows a recent session with colleagues at a local specialist public school who are enthusiastic about onboarding these innovative teaching practices regardless of the challenges that they're facing. It's just one example of a school we've been working with, exploring how we can develop these practical frameworks and methods that then can be used in the classroom to try and push a lot of these skills that the new curriculums are looking for, and particularly about supporting students in thinking more critically and deeply about complex problems. For us, this builds directly on our own teaching. We teach in design thinking and strategic design within our design programs, and we see firsthand the ways in which these methods can support structured, iterative ways of engaging with complex real-world challenges. And it's really this experience that's led us to question what role these same approaches might play more broadly in school education. What we want to start with is a context that we think that most of you will already recognise. Internationally and locally in Australia, education systems are undergoing significant change. We're seeing rapid technological development, particularly with the rise of artificial intelligence. And it's not just about changing tools, it's changing what counts as valuable skills and knowledge. And at the same time, there's increasing uncertainty about the future. Students are being prepared for jobs, technologies, and problems that don't yet exist or are still being established. And as such, the full impact of these unpredictable circumstances are not yet understood. And as a result, schools are under increasing pressure, not just to integrate new technologies, but to fundamentally rethink what they are preparing students for. An example that reinforces this problem comes from a recent workshop we ran with a large local public high school. They invited us in to work with their entire teaching cohort with the aim of developing a more future-ready approach to teaching. As we worked through a series of design thinking activities, it quickly became clear that the teacher held very different understandings of what future-ready actually meant, both as a concept and in relation to their students. This highlighted a key challenge from the outset. Even before addressing how to implement these new approaches, there wasn't a shared understanding of the problem itself within the teaching environment. So if we ask the question, what are we actually preparing students for? There's a surprising level of agreement. Across the OECD frameworks, the World Economic Forum reports, and employer studies, we consistently see the same kinds of skills emerging: creativity, collaboration, problem solving, adaptability. And what's important is that these aren't new. Over the past 20 years, there's actually been a shift from focusing primarily on disciplinary specialist knowledge and expertise to what we now call 21st century skills. But what has changed, particularly with AI, is that these capabilities are no longer just desirable. They're increasingly essential because many routine cognitive tasks are becoming automated. So the emphasis is shifting towards what we might think of as distinctly human capabilities. For example, in our own academic curriculum, we're currently dealing directly with this issue. Our UX program, or user experience design, which focuses on the development of digital interfaces for human interaction, is currently undergoing significant change. As of 2026, AI has now been used to write the code for the digital products that our students produce for the assessment, code which only recently was written by the students themselves. This means that we have had to alter the curriculum significantly to remove coding as a taught skill set and instead educate soft skills such as problem investigation, creativity, project adaptability, and collaboration. And more, we're moving far away from technology to do this. So building on that context, we're also seeing a significant shift in how learning is assessed. Frameworks like the University of Melbourne's new metrics and the broader OECD work are moving beyond traditional grades and standardized testing. Instead, they focus on what are often called complex competencies, things like collaboration, agency, and ethical thinking. This shift is also reflected in the work of Sandra Milligan, who actually leads the Melbourne Metrics program at the University of Melbourne. She argues that traditional assessment systems have been very effective at measuring what students know, but less effective at capturing the kinds of complex capabilities needed to thrive in real-world contexts. So what we're seeing now is an attempt to rebalance that, to move from assessing knowledge alone towards recognizing what students can actually do. But this shift also creates pressure. Because if we are now assessing these kinds of capabilities, the question becomes, how are they actually being developed in the everyday classroom practice? And this leads to what we see as a central problem. We now have a fairly clear understanding of what skills matter, even if within schools they are still being debated. We are starting to change how we assess those skills, but we don't yet have a clear shared way of teaching them in everyday classroom practice. So there's a kind of misalignment emerging between aspiration, assessment, and pedagogy. And it's this gap that this paper is really focused on. One of the main responses to this challenge has been project-based learning. PBL is widely used and it aligns really well with what we've been talking about. It's interdisciplinary, it's grounded in real-world problems, and there's strong evidence that it supports things like collaboration, creativity, and problem solving. In fact, recent reviews of the literature consistently shows that PBL can be very effective in developing these kinds of capabilities across different educational contexts. But at the same time, those studies also highlight a number of ongoing challenges. One of the key issues is that implementation is highly variable. PBL looks very different depending on the subject area, the teacher, and the institutional context. There's no single agreed on model for what good PBL actually looks like in practice. Teachers also report quite practical difficulties, things like designing meaningful projects, managing time, assessing complex work, and scaffolding student learning effectively within these environments. So while PBL is clearly promising and widely adopted, it doesn't consistently provide a clear or structured framework that teachers can easily apply with confidence. And we think that's where the next part of this argument begins.
So this is where design thinking comes in. But what's important here is that design thinking is not just a broad framework. It's made up of a set of practical methods that teachers can use, and it provides strategies for working through complex open-ended problems, such as empathizing with users, generating ideas, prototyping solutions, and iteratively testing them in context. And this is one of the reasons it has been used so widely and adopted in industry. It's been used in fields like product design, service design, and organizational innovation, specifically because it helps teams navigate complexity, bringing together multiple perspectives, working iteratively, and then refining ideas through testing rather than trying to solve problems in one step. We're also starting to see this move into higher education, particularly in design and interdisciplinary programs, where students are working on real-world complex challenges. Within our own area of academia, we have used real-world complex challenges such as poverty, product recycling, fast fashion, regional education, and climate change in collaboration with associated organizations to explore human-centered innovation. We have developed structured curriculum settings that follow a program of delivery, but also allow for flexibility and adaptation when needed. But in school contexts, particularly in secondary education, applications of design thinking are still relatively limited and often not clearly defined. So while elements of design thinking are sometimes used, such as brainstorming, prototyping, user research, they are not always connected into a coherent pedagogical framework. And what that means is that at this point, design thinking exists more as a collection of tools or activities rather than a fully developed approach to structuring learning in classrooms. This is where we think its potential lies. This leads to the core proposition of this paper. If schools are now expected to develop and assess complex human capabilities, then we need pedagogical frameworks that can support that in practice. And the argument that we are putting forward is that design thinking may offer a missing bridge, particularly as a way of structuring project-based learning. This is not about declaring that design thinking is new. It's about suggesting that it may provide a more coherent, structured way of linking what we value, how we assess, and how we actually design learning experiences. Another aspect of design thinking that we think is particularly relevant here is that it is inherently interdisciplinary in nature. When design thinking is used effectively, it rarely sits within a single discipline. Instead, it draws on multiple forms of knowledge, bringing together technical, social, creative, and analytical perspectives to address complex problems. This is where there's a really strong alignment with project-based learning. PBL is often framed as interdisciplinary, but one of the challenges in practice is how to meaningfully connect different subject areas within a single project. What design thinking offers is a set of methods that can help structure that process. For example, a single project might involve elements of mathematics, science, social sciences, English, and the arts, each contributing different ways of understanding the problem and developing possible solutions. Design thinking helps us make that integration possible and visible. It allows students to see how knowledge from different disciplines can be brought together and applied in context rather than remaining isolated within subject boundaries. And importantly, it also introduces a strong emphasis on human perspectives through methods like empathy, user research, and testing ideas with real users. So alongside developing technical or disciplinary knowledge, students are also encouraged to think critically about who they are designing for and how different solutions might impact people in different ways. In that sense, design thinking not only supports interdisciplinary learning, but also helps situate knowledge within real-world, human-centered contexts. At this stage, this argument is grounded not in formal data, but in ongoing interactions with high school teachers in Western Australia. What we are seeing is strong interest in both project-based learning and design thinking, but at the same time, there's uncertainty about how to apply these approaches and a lack of shared language and practical guidance. So there's enthusiasm, but also a clear need for support. And that points to a significant opportunity. There is a need to translate design thinking into forms that work in school contexts, to align it with emerging assessment frameworks, and importantly, to develop it collaboratively with teachers so that it is practical and usable, not just theoretical. So just to be very clear about the contribution, this is not an empirical study. It is a proposal or a positioning paper and the beginning of a broader research agenda. The next step is to work collaboratively with teachers and education researchers to explore how design thinking can function as a usable, scalable, pedagogical framework. How will we approach this research? We are yet to build a research format. However, there are some key components which will help us in gathering essential data. This will be a qualitative research and also practical-based research project. It will include a literature review of prevailing studies. We will canvass a range of schools for interviewing. We will seek key knowledge and perspectives from associated specialists and bodies. We will generate a specific school selection for our pilot study. We will estimate a project timeline, and we will then publish our findings. We'll finish with this. There's currently a lot of focus in education on defining and measuring future capabilities. What is often missing, however, is the recognition that design already offers a way of working with these kinds of capabilities. For those of us in design, this is familiar. Design thinking provides a set of methods for engaging with complexity, for working iteratively, and for developing solutions in real-world contexts. What we are suggesting is that this way of working doesn't need to stay within the design disciplines. It can be shared more broadly as a way of structuring learning itself. What this points to is a broader role for design, not as something separate from learning, but as a way of structuring how complex real-world problems are approached. In that sense, the methods are already familiar in design practice, may offer a useful way of supporting more coherent and effective learning experiences. Thank you for listening to our presentation. We look forward to sharing our findings on this research project in the future.